The Confederacy of Independent Systems, also known as the Separatist Alliance, was one of the belligerents in the Clone Wars, one of the largest wars in Star Wars galactic history. And on today's video, we're going to be talking about the most powerful megacorporations which supplied the droids, ships, and vehicles which composed its massive fleets and armies. While the Clone Wars involved a multitude of smaller interests and even local military forces fighting for both sides, the most powerful elements of the CIS were a small handful of business interests, each of which had representation on the Separatist Council we see in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. But what did they each bring to the table, and what role did they play within the CIS or the Republic before that? First is probably the most widely known because of their role in the Phantom Menace, and definitely the one about which most is known, the Trade Federation. The Trade Federation was originally founded over 3 centuries before the Empire, quickly coming to control all trade in the Outer Rim, and using its vast resources and influence to lobby the Senate for deregulation of trade, something which became far easier when they were granted a seat of their own within the Senate. Many outlying systems also found it easier to put themselves directly under the Trade Federation's authority, allowing it to theoretically represent their interests in the Senate, rather than functioning as direct members of the Senate themselves, as they believed this was the most efficient way to open trade between their own worlds and the rich core worlds. Among the Trade Federation's many responsibilities were the policing of commerce, dispute settling between transporters and merchants, and the defense of trade in the Rim against piracy, which was made possible by the creation of the Trade Defense Fleet, a massive private fleet and army controlled entirely by the Trade Federation itself. This included vessels like the massive and reasonably well-armed for the time Lucrehulk freighters, a hull type which would be significantly up-armed and serve as a fighter carrier and even battleship in the CIS Navy during the Clone Wars. While originally a collaboration of many species, the Trade Federation by the time of the Clone Wars was primarily run by Neimoidians. They began to chafe under proposals for taxation on trade in the Outer Rim, which they had largely managed to avoid for centuries. Although even in situations where taxes or tariffs were instituted, they managed to avoid paying most of them, only paying about 1/3 of what they theoretically should have, with the rest secretly funding the people who like and subscribe for more Star Wars lore videos. In the year 33 BBY, or 33 years before the Battle of Yavin, in order to negotiate with Chancellor Finis Valorum and other members of the Republic who were proposing taxes in previously tax-free zones, in exchange for allowing greater defense force build-up by cartels like the Trade Federation, Techno-Union, Commerce Guild, Corporate Alliance, and others, Senator Palpatine organized a negotiation summit on the planet Ariadu, the homeworld of future Grand Moff Tarkin. The Trade Federation leading up to this point was run by a self-electing directorate with 7 members, chaired by a viceroy, and all of those members were present at the summit. At this point, the directorate included 4 humans, a Gran, a Celestian, and Viceroy Nute Gunray. Shortly before, Viceroy Nute Gunray had begun secretly allying with Senator Palpatine in the guise of Darth Sidious, who had promised him ever-increasing access to resources and more concentrated power within the Trade Federation. What exactly he meant by this was soon revealed at the summit. Palpatine organized the assassination of the other 6 members of the Directorate not named Nute Gunray, framing the militant wing of the anti-corporate Nebula Front of the Outer Rim for the attack, which had actually been planning to attack the summit, though they were only targeting Chancellor Valorum. This left Gunray in sole control over the Trade Federation, where he remained while overseeing the blockade of Naboo, all the way through the end of the Clone Wars, where Darth Vader offered him a severance package, but not the fun kind. Most of the Trade Federation's defense forces and droid armies were actually developed in-house. The manufacturers of the Lucrehulk Horsch Kessel drives had originally been owned privately and exclusively by Neimoidians, though by the time of Naboo, it was a direct subsidiary of the Trade Federation itself, which now was closely associated with Neimoidian homeworlds. On top of the production of Lucrehulks for the Trade Federation, Horsch Kessel would be involved in the production of other ships used by other megacorporations and then the CIS Navy, like the Commerce Guild Destroyer, also known as the Recusant, and the Banking Clan Frigate, also known as the Munificent. The ground forces it used, including the B-1 battle droids, armored assault tanks, and multi-troop transports, were similarly produced in-house by a company called Bactoid Armor Workshops, which had also subcontracted the Geonosian hives, represented by Archduke Poggle the Lesser on the Separatist Council. Following the failures at the invasion of Naboo, Factoid Armor Workshops was mostly dissolved because of their connections to the Trade Federation and their material being used in the invasion. Although another company, Factoid Combat Automata, secretly gained most of its assets and continued droid production under the Trade Federation and our next group, the Techno Union. There were already strong connections here because the chief executive at Factoid was Wat Tambor, who was also the foreman of the Techno Union. Even during the Clone Wars, the Trade Federation, like most of the megacorporations we'll actually talk about today, maintained representation in the Republic Senate through Senator Lott Dodd, and claimed any Trade Federation involvement with the CIS was the act of rogue elements under Viceroy Gunray, though in reality they were pretty much fully cooperating with the CIS the whole time, and this was eventually brought to light. Moving on to the Techno Union, the Senate representation came through Senator Goom Som and Ishi Tib. The purpose of the Techno Union was to be a collection of various heavy manufacturing concerns, which, much like the Trade Federation, was allowed to maintain its own droid armies to protect its interests, something that happened fairly commonly with these large megacorporations because the Republic didn't have a standing army of its own, and so especially in the Outer Rim, groups like the Trade Federation or Techno Union were left to govern and exploit the regions as they saw fit. So as we see in Episode 1, these armies were used for subjugation as much as they were used for protection against piracy. A lot of what the Techno Union as an organization did involved coordinating efforts between member firms on manufacturing, weapons development, and even managing shipping, much like the Trade Federation. While some of the companies involved in the Techno Union were direct subsidiaries of the Techno Union itself, many of the manufacturing interests in the galaxy were at least members of some form, including Kuat Drive Yards, Republic Cinar Systems, and Blastech, all of which helped keep the premise of neutrality for the Techno Union as an organization because those members all remained Republic loyalists, although a lot of them did start distancing themselves from the conglomerate over the course of the war. While the Techno Union was directly based on Skako, it owned planets which either would become or had always been important manufacturing centers. It established factories on planets like Hypori, but it had also come to control the planet Forost, one of the largest shipyards in the Republic in the past and the place which had probably the strongest claim to originating Republic naval tradition. Forost would also be the location where one of the most powerful ships in the CIS Navy, the Bulwark, was developed. Throughout the war, the Techno Union would be the driving force behind the Separatist war machine, having a direct hand in building huge numbers of Separatist ships and vehicles in cooperation with groups like Senator Tiki's Free DAC Engineering Corps, which was also represented on the council, and even engaging in somewhat more arcane experimental weapons, like the attempt by Skakoan scientists associated with the Techno Union to genetically alter members of the Nalvanian species into weapons of war. Having the manufacturing facilities to build these vast navies like the Techno Union did, and having control over large amounts of territory and trade routes, along with the stores of credits like the Trade Federation did, and the banking clan, but we'll get to them later, only means so much without the raw materials to actually build anything, and this is where the Commerce Guild of Felucia comes in, controlled by President Shumai Agasim. The Commerce Guild included some shipwrights and manufacturers as well, like the Sorasub Corporation of Sullust, but its biggest contributions likely did come from raw materials, thanks to members like the Mining Guild. While probably not quite as powerful as the Trade Federation, its history goes back twice as far, to 700 BBY, when it began pressuring companies and planets in the Rim to join. Join here meaning planets and their entire populations could be bought up or just taken over by the Guild, which even happened with Castel itself, home of President Shumai's people. This servitude was ostensibly in return for the Commerce Guild stepping in to stimulate the planet economically, saving them from economic collapse. Mai was eventually able to gather the funds to repurchase Castel from the Commerce Guild, but once she did this and freed her people, she just jacked up rents and proved her loyalty to the Guild itself, which is ultimately what elevated her to the position of president. This was a fate which would befall many other planets, especially during the Clone Wars, when the already meager protections the Republic did afford against these conglomerates were surrendered upon planets joining the CIS, even if they joined voluntarily. This actually led to a persistent state of conflict within the CIS itself, so there were rebels against the rebels. But as long as these interests were making money and getting the resources they needed to those megacorporations, they didn't particularly mind, and the Separatist Parliament was powerless to stop them. Enforcement of Commerce Guild interests against these populations was done with their own droid armies as well, including the Dwarf Spider Droid and Homing Spider Droid, along with fleets of Diamond-class cruisers and Recusant destroyers. Moving on, probably the most obscure of these groups is the Corporate Alliance, led by Magistrate Passeler-Gent, which acted as, quote, a negotiating body for the galaxy's largest commercial firms, end quote. These corporations, which probably did include several members of the other groups we've mentioned as well, since there was a lot of overlap and a lot of similar interests between a lot of them, had significant influence in the Outer Rim, and like the others was also authorized to use a private army to protect their interests, which largely just meant enforcing their will on local populations, while similarly chafing under any attempts by the Republic to police their actions, limiting their profits. These interests were enforced by ships like the Fantel, for which unfortunately no official design exists, and the Persuader-class droid enforcer tank, otherwise known as the Snail Tank. Finally, we have the Banking Clan, whose origins stretch to the farthest reaches of Republic history, although they likely wouldn't become direct members for some time, given their location on the unexplored edges of the galaxy. While the other groups we've talked about certainly had large reserves of credits, they all paled in comparison to the Banking Clan, headquartered first on Mutalinst with the Muon ruling Council of Banks, and then on Scipio. During the war, the Banking Clan financed both sides of the war, although the CIS received its loans interest-free, along with direct military support from Banking Clan hardware like the Munificent and the Hailfire droid, along with other droid models and organic troops which had previously been used in both asset protection and debt collection. The Banking Clan tried about as hard as the Trade Federation to hide its direct involvement with the CIS, although this was similarly exposed. In the Senate, it was represented by a human from Scipio named Rush Clovis, while on the Council, it was represented by the Mun chairman of the clan, San Hill. They were also responsible for some of the CIS's most influential commanders, like Admiral Porstanith, who transitioned from being a banker to being an admiral, and General Grievous, who had been essentially pressed into service by the Banking Clan as a debt collector before rising up to take over the entire CIS military after some reconstruction by Dooku. While these were the largest interests, plenty of smaller conglomerates were also present in the CIS, including those which saw themselves as direct competition to some of the larger ones we've gone over already, although none of these other ones had any representation on the Separatist Council. Probably the largest among those not represented on the Council is the Retail Caucus of Krakoidia, rivals of the Commerce Guild and essentially galactic investors, though also with their own forces like the LR-57 droid, and with commanders like Worm Loathsome, who we see trying to take over Christophsis in the Clone Wars cartoon. Since we're doing this with a bit of a focus on the Council though, there is a firm created directly by the CIS, the Hypercommunications Cartel, based out of Ando and represented by Senator Poe Nudo. This firm was largely responsible for managing Separatist communications infrastructure, but the Council also included several aides for other members and groups that we've already gone over, so several assistants for Nute Gunray were there, but there was additionally a senator named Rogwa Wudrada of the planet Aliga. I don't believe it's ever said anywhere if she represented some other interest beyond her sector, or what else she did that warranted a specific seat for Aliga on the Council. After all, other Separatist senators don't seem to have had the same access level to the Council. But that's going to do it for our look at the most powerful member groups of the CIS. I have another video going over what happened to each of them in the wake of the Clone Wars if you want to check that out. Remember to leave a like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the video, and special thanks to the patrons and channel members whose support makes this channel possible, as well as to Marmar for editing this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.